It's the 1st of September 2025, and Irish comedian Graham Linehan walks out toward a baggage claim at Heathrow Airport on the outskirts of London. He's just come from the US, and like anyone visiting an airport, is trying to leave as quickly as possible. Until Graham is stopped, not by some duty-free perfume or an overpriced coffee, but by 5 armed policemen. His crime? He sent a tweet, one that the police claim incites violence, one that read, quote, "If a trans-identified male is in a female-only space, he is committing a violent, abusive act. Make a scene, call the cops, and if all else fails, punch him in the Linehan's arrest made massive headlines in the UK as a brazen infringement upon free speech. At the calmer end, you had people arguing that the arrest was disproportionate and that the police should focus on real crime instead of words on social media. You had comments calling the UK a totalitarian state. But what few noted is that this isn't a bold new direction for the UK. It's been the trend for a long time now. So, how do we get here? What is the state of free speech in the UK today? And is it really under a greater threat than ever? Historical censorship. One of the first things to mention when it comes to the UK and free speech is that there's a lot of misinformation out there. As we talked about in our last video discussing the UK in depth, the country is struggling. But some would have you believe, especially on social media, that the UK has fallen, whatever that means. Depending on who you listen to, people need licenses for butter knives, we're in the middle of a race war, and the government will arrest you for not putting your pronouns on your LinkedIn profile. And nowhere is such nonsense parroted more than when it comes to British free speech. Singing God Save the King isn't illegal, nowhere is banning eating bacon, and we do not secretly operate under a system of Sharia law. Saying it doesn't make it true, no matter how many times those Twitter accounts that definitely aren't foreign disinformation tell you. But, and this is where things get interesting, just because online extremists are blowing an issue out of all proportion doesn't mean that the issue itself doesn't exist. Because, as we're about to see, while free speech in the UK may be far freer than Elon Musk would have you believe, that freedom is being eroded away. And worryingly, that erosion is picking up speed. Now, before we get into the weeds, we should get back to basics. Starting with the most basic question of all, where do the UK's freedom of speech laws even come from? Well, there's a long history of that, arguably going all the way back to the Magna Carta, but we don't need to go back quite that far today. Before the 20th century, freedom of speech was referred to in the UK as a residual liberty, which meant that you were free to speak openly unless specifically forbidden by the law of the day, say regarding blasphemy or obscenity, for example. There was no written right to free speech, like in the American Constitution, but people understood there was a balance between freedom of expression and the rule of law. In 1950, things became more codified when the UK became one of the first signatories of the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR. The convention had Articles 9, 10, and 11, which covered freedom of thought, expression, and assembly, respectively. But at the time, this was only protected by European law, which meant it could only be enforced by petitioning Strasbourg. In 1998, that all changed when the Human Rights Act was passed by UK Parliament, integrating the ECHR, as it then was, into British law. Since then, there have been changes relating to the internet, terrorism, protests, and more, but the 1998 law underpins all of it. So what does this law do? Well, it allows people to hold opinions and share information or ideas, even if they're unpopular or offensive. However, it's what's referred to in British law as a qualified right, meaning the government or courts can restrict speech when it's necessary to protect national security, public safety, prevent crime and disorder, or safeguard the rights and reputations of others. It also doesn't override other legislation like national security secrecy laws or the rights a person might have to privacy and the right to a fair trial. Clearly then, the UK has never been much of a free speech absolutist country like the United States. And here, we probably need to talk about the cultural differences as far as free speech goes between the US and the UK. Because it feels like at least some of the outrage Americans feel on Brits' behalf is due to people who grew up with the First Amendment transplanting those values onto a really different culture. As a somewhat light-hearted example, Take school uniforms. In the United States, kids who go to public schools, for the most part, are allowed to wear their own clothes, although it should be noted, even this is subject to some restrictions around modesty, offensive slogans on t-shirts, etc. Being able to express oneself, even through something as banal as clothing, is seen as an important element of an individual's right to freedom of speech. In the UK, they're a little bit different. Kids going to almost all schools in the UK are required to wear a set uniform as designated by the school. There is no laws to say they have to be ugly, but that does seem to be the theme. Regardless, older kids get to adhere to a strict dress code, which usually means workwear, like suits. In Britain, different clothes in schools are seen as a distraction for the pupils, and making everyone wear the same thing levels the playing field in terms of the visible differences in wealth. It stops kids being singled out and bullied for what they wear. This isn't the only reason this practice happens in the UK, but it is an important part of it. Ostensibly, this is a restriction on any student's single freedom of expression. This might seem outrageous to some of our American viewers, but it is a decent, non-controversial showcase of the national differences in attitudes and the nuanced view of freedom of speech in the United Kingdom. The point is that free speech in Britain has always been more restricted than in America. Depending on your view, that might be seen as better or worse, but the reality is, it's just a different cultural fabric woven into the national tapestry. It's not just school uniforms. It's everything within the country. You can largely think of the search for that balance between the rule of law and freedom of speech as the basic idea that underpins British freedom of speech, even today. And that concept has waxed and waned throughout history, shows a complicated past. Even when free speech was considered a residual liberty, so you were free to say anything not explicitly forbidden, blasphemy or obscenity laws would see you locked up for breaking them. Take the 1727 conviction of Edmund Curll for a publication of erotic fiction like Venus in the Cloister or The Nun in Her Smock. Spicy! Or look at films. The British Board of Film Classification was still banning mainstream movies up until the turn of the century. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and A Clockwork Orange were both banned until 1999, while retailers in the 80s were prosecuted, usually unsuccessfully, for supplying VHS copies of banned films like Evil Dead. And so you can see that freedom of speech in the UK has always kind of been a residual liberty even after 1998. Gag orders is another example. Gag order, a common term for an injunction or super injunction, is a judge's directive forbidding public disclosure of information on a particular matter, usually to protect privacy, prevent harm to participants, or to protect national security. It's a bit like an automatic NDA. A famous example came in 2010, when England football team captain John Terry was granted a super injunction to stop the news of the world from reporting on an extramarital affair that he had been having. Now, this didn't stop the affair becoming public knowledge anyway, so clearly they do have their limits. But there's still a clear limit on free speech. The Official Secrets Act is another carve-out for national security purposes. It's common sense that a nation's national secrets should not be public knowledge. You break the Official Secrets Act, and you could be looking at a few years in prison and an unlimited fine if you're lucky. If you're not, you could face espionage charges, and that is a lot worse. There are also laws in the UK covering libel and defamation, which, whilst an infringement on absolute free speech and certainly imperfect, many in the country are generally happy with. But these two are a blunt instrument and are crazy strict by European and American standards. There have also been moments in British political history where infringement of free speech by Westminster has since been considered unjustified in the court of public opinion. A law from 1998 to 1994 banned spokespeople from Sinn Féin, the nationalist Northern Irish political party that was associated with the Provisional Irish Republican Army, from speaking on TV, with their comments instead having to be dubbed. In the late 80s, the British government tried to stop UK media reporting on Peter Wright's MI5 memoir Spycatcher even after it was published abroad. All the while, the secret British spy satellite Zircon was hovering above the Earth, and when the BBC caught wind of it, the government raided their offices in Scotland to stop a documentary about the satellite airing. So, largely, Britain has long tried to maintain a balance between the public good and infringing on the lives of its citizens. Sometimes it's fallen on the sensible side of the line, at others on the censorious side. But there's reason to believe the balance present for so many generations before it may now be under threat, that the government is no longer occasionally falling down on the censorship side of things, but bounding over the fence and frolicking gaily among the restrictions. And it all starts in one place, because of course it does. It's the internet. British censorship, the internet. Now, the more you look at British censorship and the curtailment of free speech in the modern era, the more insidious it looks than anything we've seen in a rather long while. Let's start with everyone's favourite place. Now, Parliament has a pretty long history of censoring people's actions and words on the internet. Take the Communications Act of 2003, for example, which prohibits, and we'll quote here, by means of a public electronic communications network, a message or other matter that is grossly offensive or of an indecent, obscene, or menacing character. So, send someone a threat on social media, well, that law could consider it illegal. In January 2010, Paul Chambers tweeted that if Robin Hood Airport in Nottinghamshire didn't reopen after snow closures, he'd blow the airport sky high. Now, the airport itself didn't take this seriously, but an off-duty manager stumbled upon the tweet and reported it, leading to police involvement. Chambers was prosecuted under Section 127 of the Communications Act 2003 for sending a menacing electronic message. He was convicted in a magistrate's court, fined £385 plus costs, and lost his job as a result. His appeal in Crown Court was also dismissed. Eventually, the case went to the High Court in 2012, where a 3-judge panel unanimously quashed his conviction, ruling that a reasonable person would have seen it as an ill-judged joke, not a credible threat. Obviously, the judgment clarified that for a message to be menacing, it must create fear or apprehension in people who see the message. In this case, Chambers was acquitted, but his case serves as a good example of how overzealous policing has led to a history of absurd charges. The Communications Act also covers things online like hateful content. The leading case was about racist voicemails, for example. Certain sexually explicit communications, persistent misuse, like calling someone over and over, and knowingly false hoax-type messages, like fake bomb threats. But beware, there's a lot of overlap with the recently passed into law Online Safety Act, which is expected to take precedent in some cases, updating the offences for the more modern era of the internet. Landing on the British public's devices in 2025, although it was passed by the Rishi Sunak Conservative government in 2023, the Online Safety Act, on the surface, appears to be there to do a noble thing: protect children on the internet. The way it's been implemented is concerning for those who value free speech. The new law requires a verifiable government ID to be input to certain websites that show explicit material. Now look, there's nothing wrong with ensuring that those who are underage aren't watching things online that can harm their development. Certain states in the US have the same laws, but for many, this is seen as an enormous risk to people's personal information. We are in an unprecedented time of human data harvesting, and that data falling into the wrong hands is pretty scary. Data leaks can run the gamut, from irritating telemarketing calls all the way to full-on identity theft. Companies and governments have proved time and time again that they cannot be trusted to handle such sensitive data. For example, look at the T app, a dating safety app for women that does background checks on men for red flag behavior like abuse. This was an app in the US that also needed a government ID for its users to be verified. T's own privacy policy said that the information with the IDs on was instantly deleted. But when the app was hacked in July of 2025, 72,000 images submitted by women were accessed. Women who had joined the app to date safely had their data stolen, their IDs shared online, and even had their addresses doxed. This was an app supposed to keep women safe, only for a single data breach to undermine their goal. Now, sure, that's a company, but many Brits don't trust the government to keep their identities safe from cyber attacks either. Look at July 2025 for proof. That month, it was revealed that in 2022, 19,000 Afghans who were trying to come to the UK to flee the Taliban had their data leaked accidentally by an official working at UK Special Forces headquarters. The Taliban government has since caught wind of the leak, and whilst they have said they're not monitoring or arresting Afghans affected by the leak, the Taliban don't exactly have the most stellar record when it comes to honesty, do they? Relatives of Afghans whose data was leaked state that they fear for their family members who are still in the country. Because of course they do. So when the government asks for your ID to legally see explicit content, you can imagine why some might be hesitant to do so. If Special Forces headquarters, which is supposed to be one of the most data-secure places in the entire country, is letting out leaks like that, what hope is there for people's IDs in some company's server room which won't be anywhere near as secure I feel like this would be a perfect moment for this video to be sponsored by Surfshark VPN, because it would let you access those sites pretending you're not in the UK, which would circumvent this whole stupid thing, in my opinion, allegedly. All right, so don't do it then. You are still free to make that choice. I mean, it's not a sovereign right, and that's more than fair. But those who want to skirt around the law with things like VPNs, there we go, will do so. In fact, VPN services massively spiked in just the day after the law came into effect. And I personally would recommend Surfshark. I don't even know if they're sponsoring this video, but they're the best one that I've used. Even more concerning is the government's response to this uptick in VPN use, with some officials claiming they want to go after VPN platforms next, claiming that those who use VPNs are endangering children. This has been a common tactic towards any real critique of the law, with those in power throwing their hands up and screaming, "Won't somebody think of the children?" when everyone can already agree that kids online need better protections, but eliminating VPNs would effectively kill privacy on the internet for Brits. The point is not about it's about government overreach. The definition of what is considered worth needing an ID for with the OSA is entirely and wholly up to the UK government and their communications standard agency, Ofcom. And almost immediately after the law was enacted, it was used to go after things that aren't of any threat to children. The biggest example of this is Spotify, the music streaming service. Spotify, as a service for people over the age of 13, has children on its platform, but it also hosts more adult content like 18+ music videos. And as a platform that allows users to create content like playlists that could include such videos, this means it falls within the scope of the OSA. Spotify has asked users to verify their age through facial recognition. Users must take a selfie, which will be analyzed using face scanning technology from verification service Yachty to estimate their age. But if the system determines a user to be underage, their account will be deactivated. There is a 90-day grace period. However, during this time, users will receive an email allowing them to reactivate their account, where they must verify their ID on the platform within 7 days. If Spotify still can't confirm a user's age after the 90-day grace period, or if no action is taken within 7 days of reactivation, the account will be permanently deleted. So yes, even Spotify needs an ID check, which has felt to many like a bit of an overreach in the OSA's scope. So, there's clearly a debate to be had about what should and shouldn't fall into the scope of the OSA. And Ofcom is expected to use discretion when judging what kind of content is deemed harmful. But all this has done is open up another debate about how independent Ofcom really is. If any government of the day is able to put pressure on Ofcom and influence it to ensure certain platforms are within its scope, well, that could be considered censorship just by another name. The UK government has also increasingly pursued social media users for posts they make in violation of various laws, mainly around the incitement of violence. Almost everyone will remember when fellow YouTuber Marcus Meacham, otherwise known as Count Dankula, got in trouble with Scottish police after teaching his pug to do a Nazi salute in response to certain Reich-coded phrases. And while it's true that there have long been penalties for making Nazi salutes in the UK, it's also true that dragging Meacham through the courts was pretty uncontestably a waste of the justice system's time. In 2017, it was estimated by The Times and The Telegraph, two right-leaning newspapers in the UK, that 9 people were being arrested every day in the UK in relation to hate speech, many of such cases occurring online. The most recent example would be Lucy Connolly, who was jailed after the Southport attacks and subsequent asylum hotel riots. Connolly was quoted as having written, "Mass deportation now, set fire to all the hotels full of the for all I care. If that makes me racist, so be it." Now, her arrest and conviction sparked a fierce debate around freedom of speech in the country, as the law accused Connolly of inciting violence with her tweet. Now, there's been a lot of misinformation from all sides on this, but as far as we can tell, Connolly also showed little remorse for the tweet and stated privately that if she got in trouble, that she would use mental health as an excuse. She eventually pled guilty to inciting racial hatred and was sentenced to 31 months in prison, although she was released way ahead of that schedule in August 2025. Many argued that the punishment didn't fit the crime. During the far-right unrest that arose around the country as a result of the brutal Southport murders of 2024, a woman named Donna Conner from Hartlepool threw a brick at police and encouraged a young boy to throw things too. She only received a 2-year prison term, which makes Colony's sentence for a post online appear a little over the top by comparison. And then you have Ricky Jones, a Labour councillor who called for far-right activists' throats to be cut at an anti-racism rally. Unlike Connolly, he went to trial and was acquitted by a jury. This has led some to accuse the government of a two-tier justice system, where very similar crimes lead to different sentencing outcomes depending on who you are. Now, we should be clear that things are a bit more nuanced than that. Jones took the risk and went to trial, while Connolly didn't. Had she lawyered up, it's entirely possible that she would have been acquitted too. Still, advocates of free speech in the UK have argued that it's either legal to make comments that incite violence, or it's not. The government can't be selective. And that's just some of the most controversial stuff that references the internet. In real life, there is a similarly concerning trajectory. British freedom of speech. Joke? Many of the practices that the UK engages in relation to free speech might send members of other countries looking to grab firearms and barricade the streets. But in the UK, owing to that culturally sought balance of law and expression, this trend has seemed to go on without much of a fuss. And indeed, some of the changes to freedom of speech laws since the new millennium have been welcomed by Brits. Take the Terrorism Act, for example, which has been updated numerous times in the past several decades to counter extremist threats. This makes it a criminal offense to collect or possess information that is likely to be of use for a terrorist. Mainly, this is referring to weapons-making manuals disseminated by these groups, but the publications are still illegal to have without a reasonable and valid excuse like legitimate journalism work. And even then, the police can still confiscate and seize your property whilst that is considered. Journalists, therefore, have to be really careful with handling these kinds of sensitive materials. However, even some of the most ardent free speech supporters will tell you that this is one law that is worth keeping, as the public risk just isn't worth it. Similarly, the Act outlaws the glorification of terrorism, another one that curtails free speech, but you won't find many people complaining about, or at least you wouldn't have until this year. That's because June 2025 saw the law used to prescribe Palestine Action as a terrorist organization after several members of the group broke into the Royal Air Force Base Breeze Norton and spray-painted 2 planes to protest the treatment of Gaza by Israel, as well as the UK government's program of sending weapons and military support to Israel. The vandalism apparently did £7 million worth of damage. Now look, we should be clear that this action was, and I'll use a technical term here, hella illegal. Anyone who believes that breaking into an RAF base to damage military equipment shouldn't result in harsh jail sentences has crossed the line from free speech advocate to idiot. However, there is a serious debate about whether proscription is the answer. Under the law, merely showing support for a prescribed group becomes a serious offense that can lead to up to 14 years in jail. It's also an offense that crosses borders. That means you can be an Irish citizen in Ireland, where Palestine Action isn't outlawed, and express perfectly legal support for the group, only to be arrested the moment you set foot in the UK and locked up for over a decade. Not a problem when the prescribed group in question is, say, ISIS or the Wagner Group, 2 other organizations on the list, but a bigger issue when a significant minority are open supporters. Immediately after the RAF incident, 29 people protesting Palestine Action's prescription sat peacefully and quietly with signs saying they supported the group. Every single one was arrested, including an 83-year-old retired priest named Sue Parfitt. Not exactly Hezbollah, are they? That number, though, has only grown, and as of late September, the number was as high as 1,600 people who have been arrested for showing support for the group. Irish author Sally Rooney publicly came out in support and claimed that she could not travel to the UK in September to collect a book prize, as she had been advised that she could not enter the UK without potentially facing arrest. But it's not just Palestine Action. Take the Edward Snowden leaks, for example. Beyond the British government trying to get the founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, extradited to the United States from London's Ecuadorian embassy for more than a decade, London has a beef with WikiLeaks. Part of the mass surveillance we know about today came from Edward Snowden's whistleblowing, but his leaks were not just about US practices, but the Five Eyes as well. The Five Eyes is the Anglosphere's global surveillance network, encompassing the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The British government was majorly implicated in programs like Tempora, which involved tapping into global fiber optic cables to assess global internet traffic and collect vast data stores from millions upon millions of users. And in 2013, a threat of legal action by Westminster caused the left-leaning newspaper The Guardian to destroy the documents it had pertaining to American and British government surveillance apparatus in question. Even in the interests of national security, the government going after the free press here did not look good. The UK also has other attacks on free speech that we see in other countries, like bans on certain media like books, video games, and films. There are also laws that infringe on free speech to allow the justice system to work. Many high-profile court cases in the UK happen behind closed doors. It's why you sometimes see those courtroom drawings as some of the only visuals of the trial itself, although the sentencing is often streamed live in big enough UK cases. The idea is not to create a public frenzy that could jeopardize the trial. Similarly, you have gag orders and injunctions, like we mentioned before, which legally stops the revealing of certain details in a case. Super injunctions are so tightly locked that people aren't even allowed to mention the injunction itself. Meanwhile, other cases are just silly. In 2006, a 21-year-old man named Sam Brown from Belfast was arrested for walking up to police while inebriated and asking, "Excuse me, do you realize your horse is gay?" The police argued that these were homophobic remarks and tried to charge him under Section 5 of the Public Order Act 1986. The charges were later dropped. Even the gay horse whisperers aren't safe. Now look, we're joking, of course, but the fact that this was something that got someone genuinely arrested and charged is both silly and a waste of resources. But by far the biggest attack on free speech in the UK has been successive governments' targeting of protests and protesters. So, for starters, a lawful protest has to be organised in advance with the police to allow it to go ahead. It has to be in writing with at least 6 days' notice to give them time to prepare. For some, this is sensible and it ensures the people's voices are heard in an organised way that keeps the public safe during a time that is emotionally tense, especially when there is the possibility of counter-protesters. But others claim that it's an attack on the right to organise. One of the more recent laws to come about that targets protesters is the Public Order Act of 2023. It started under Boris Johnson's government and gives magistrates the right to issue court orders on individuals they believe are capable of causing serious disruption during a protest. They're called, creatively, Serious Disruption Prevention Orders. Individuals who have previously committed protest-related offences or ignored court-imposed restrictions on at least 2 occasions could be made subject to an SDPO, and violating them can lead to 6 months in prison alongside an unlimited fine. These orders impose a range of restraints on a person, including preventing them from being in a particular place or area, participating in disruptive activities, and being with protest groups at given times. They can also stop individuals from using the internet to encourage protest-related offensives. This is in direct opposition to the ECHR's articles on a person having the right to freely assemble and speak. Again, from a public order perspective, you can see how this could be beneficial, but protests are supposed to be disruptive by their very nature. It's kind of the point, isn't it? So when you have laws like 2022, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, which allows British police to put conditions on protests based on their noise level, is it any wonder the government are being accused of trying to take the sting out of public demonstrations? The Crime and Policing Bill, by the time you're watching this, has probably passed into law or it's in its final stages of being read. Among other welcome policing reforms, it also targets protests, being the 4th bill to do so in 4 years. This one wants to criminalise parts of peaceful protests even further by banning face coverings. The UK's masses of CCTV cameras and the advance of AI facial recognition technology might just be part of the reason for that one. So, where does that leave us? Well, to be frank, we're not really sure. On the one hand, despite everything bad that we've been telling you about today in regards to British free speech being under threat, it is still very much alive in the country. There are strong journalistic institutions, laws are robust, and life goes on without descending into an Orwellian nightmare. If I wanted to, I could stand on a street tomorrow wearing a placard saying Keir Starmer's a prick, and all that would happen to me would be a whole lot of high fives from a public in agreement. For all certain politicians may want to claim the UK today is on par with North Korea, the fact is that Brits still have the ability to insult the government, to say things in public that are unpopular. Just witness the University of Sussex getting fined £500,000 this year for not protecting gender-critical speech. But on the other hand, it's hard to ignore what looks like a campaign from successive British governments to crack down on free speech and protests to such an extent that they become basically meaningless. Cracking down on freedom of speech in all its forms sets a dangerous precedent for future leaders who are already on a slippery slope. Authoritarian tendencies are growing across the world, and especially among European liberal democracies. Whether it's Hungary banning gay pride marches or German climate activists being arrested and charged with forming a criminal organization under new protest laws, these trends are alarming. And in the UK, the signs of these trends are most clear to see in the laws surrounding freedom of speech and freedom of expression, as well as mass surveillance. In theory, all it would take is one authoritarian leading leader to spearhead further crackdowns across the entire country, and suddenly your nation looks suspiciously like an autocracy overnight, even if life goes on mostly as it did before. These fears were once inconceivable to much of Western Europe, but they have to be recognized and taken seriously in today's political climate. Countries with strong institutions like the UK are in a better spot than most, and it would be both irresponsible and frankly moronic to suggest that the UK is rapidly sliding towards inevitable dictatorship. But authoritarianism no longer just fights democracy in an open battlefield, it also subverts it from within. And the more that countries like the UK flirt with authoritarian ideas and laws, the easier it is to slide further. What's more, trust in those institutions is also at a record low. Back in January, a YouGov poll recorded just 28% of people having confidence in the House of Commons. If you were to take the American view, you might say that dialogue, education, and debate are the only ways to genuinely change people's perspectives on anything, and that criminalizing certain speech doesn't stop it from happening, it just drives it underground. But the UK just doesn't operate on that frequency. There is an earnest historical belief within the country that not all speech is good, and that it needs to be restricted in some form at times to ensure a smooth running of society. And the country, to its credit, has a long, continuous history of healthy democratic institutions, even despite these nuances. What we're trying to say is what the average American and the average Brit would deem an ideal free speech environment would likely look pretty different, and applying US-centric free speech attitudes to the UK would be like trying to make everyone in Britain boil their water in the microwave instead of a kettle. It just doesn't compute. But the choice to have this nuance requires an electorate and politicians who have a strong understanding of the culture surrounding the critical balance between rule of law and freedom of expression. And that is where the issue truly lies. When it feels like that balance is leaning in the wrong direction, there is bound to be pushback. At the time of writing, the English public are locked in a fierce battle over whether it's okay to put flags up and spray paint a St. George's Cross on roundabouts. I know, our political drama is absolutely thrilling. And as much as there is an alarming trend toward free speech restriction in the UK, we'd like to make it clear that it's not like it seems on social media. If you hold an English flag up, say you love your country, and eat a bacon sandwich, no one's going to come and arrest you. But as the Graham Linehan case shows, the British government does have the propensity to put that critical balance in jeopardy. Here was an Irish citizen who lives in Arizona on a US residence visa being arrested in the UK by armed police for a dumb joke he made on Twitter. I mean, does that seem normal to you? And there's a serious debate worth having over what free speech means to the people of the country and how it can best be implemented. Unfortunately, outside of sound bites and agendas, the overarching issue isn't something the government has chosen to focus a great deal of time on. A digital bill of rights would be a step in the right direction, but it just isn't on the government's radar right now. Nobody wants people to be upset, offended, or hurt by what someone else says. The people looking to infringe on free speech are, for the most part, well-intentioned people who don't want to see others needlessly hurt. And that's noble, but the state needs to find that balance because it cannot alone be the enforcer of what people can and cannot say. Freedom's not something you just decide to have or get rid of in a country. It's built over generations through culture, institutions, and the rule of law into a robust framework that tries to uplift the rest of the nation. This is still the case for the UK for the most part, but consider this video a bit of a cautionary tale. The issues we've brought up today, they're very real, and just as freedom is built brick by brick, that's also how it's eroded, bill by bill, line by line, by degrees, over time. You simply can't balance on an unsure foundation, and the more the UK leans towards technocracy and mass surveillance, the more that balance will start to disappear. Thank you for watching.